that we've been working on the TESF project, where Carmen, myself, Faith, and Bertha are working with student activists to conceptualize a university as a sustainable community. And at the regional network meeting a couple of months ago, we had the pleasure of meeting Priya, and I thought she would have a lot of insight into participatory processes that would be of relevance to people who are working in the higher education space, but also without it. So I have the pleasure of introducing to you today our second speaker in our installment of the SARChI-HEHD seminar series. Dr. Priya Vallabh is a restorier, an educator, and a commons researcher who is committed to strengthening socio-ecological justice. A key part of her work is post-abyssal and decolonial thinking. This work foregrounds epistemic, contributory, and distributive justices. Her PhD research focused on the citizen sciences as enacting ecologies of knowledge in response to social-ecological risks. The study adopted a decolonial and post-abyssal framing of the citizen sciences as relational knowledge systems for the common good. In it, she used the notion of epistemic cultures to better consider the ways in which we make knowledge together. This work has been taken forward into a geosciences project, which works with practitioners to reaccount for the work through post-abyssal restoring. In addition, Dr. Vallabh has a growing interest in the development of knowledge and digital commons in support of such post-abyssal work. So today, in the seminar titled For the Common Good, Engaging Post-Abyssal Methodologies for Restoring Common Knowledge Production, she will talk to us about the work of restoring for the common good. So I'm now going to quickly check if I do have the slides with me, and as soon as I have been able to share them, we will start the presentation, and the recording will also be started. Priya will have the opportunity to talk to us for about 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll use the remaining time for Q&A. Do remember to keep your mics on mute, and as soon as she starts speaking, I will turn my video off. It is actually off at the moment, I see, and then she will have the opportunity to talk to us. So just bear with me for a few more minutes while I share her slides. Priya, if there's anything that you would like to say to reintroduce yourself to everybody in the group, you can do that while I share your slides. Thank you. Your mic's on mute.
Thank you, Mika. The slides are almost with you, but I'm going to start in the meantime. Thank you for making time to engage with the work that we've been doing around post-abyssal methodologies. I'll go into a little bit more detail about what that is once the slides are up, but I am hoping that we can have a playful session. It's impossible in 45 minutes to coherently represent any decolonial theories. So what I'm intending to do is create a little pathway, drop some breadcrumbs, and find ways to invite you into experiencing what this work has enabled, rather than trying to comprehensively describe and make an argument for decolonial work. So for those of you who are interested in the theory, in the substantiation of the theory, I'm so happy to share resources with you and correspond with you. But in this presentation, I really want to try and illustrate rather than convince you of anything. Mikateko, it should be through to you by now. It's sent a confirmation on my side. So maybe I can just describe what I'm going to be doing. I'll start with a little bit of a play on perspective, inviting you into shifting or opening up to shifting perspective about what we consider to be normative, what we consider to be truthful. I'll then talk a little bit about the Abyssal Line. The Abyssal Line is a concept that Boaventura de Souza Santos has constructed, and it's primarily his work that I'm drawing on. So I'll simply introduce you to that and the notion of post-abyssal thinking, which is where my work is focused. And then I'll move to a practical example with data to show you the difference in what becomes visible when you leverage a post-colonial or decolonial post-abyssal methodology. And then I would like to end with an invitation to each of you to consider your own praxis and to consider how you are orienting to the possibility of diverse knowledges and diverse knowers, possibly people who are outside of the scientific system or who don't work with scientific knowledge specifically. So that's the pathway through what I'd like to present. Mika, how are we doing over there?
Not very well, I'm afraid. I just get the same notification as last time that the transfer is expired, and I know that's not the case because you just sent it to me now, but I'm unable to download the file.
Okay, were you able to download it when I emailed you the link a second time?
No.
Okay, I'm feeling very sad because I worked quite a lot with graphics. But I think I'll just go ahead and maybe I can send the graphics to everybody afterwards. Let me see.
Yes, I think it would be best to do that. And on my side, I'll just continue trying in case it does work out. And if it does, then I'll share it.
Okay. Okay, so I would like to orient to a particular purpose for knowledge production. The purpose I'm arguing for is not knowledge production in general. It's not considering how we make all forms of knowledge, but rather a purpose that intends to respond to matters related to our coexistence in a shared world. So if we take the purpose of knowledge production to be informing how we live together, how we coexist in a shared world, and we describe the mediation of that coexistence as intervention in the world as concerning the common good, then the legitimacy of knowledge contributions is premised on its ability to generate possibilities for interventions in and sometimes across contexts. In other words, what I'm arguing for here is if we are interested in producing knowledge to build and sustain common goods, then the criteria through which we should judge that knowledge, through which we should decide whether knowledge contributions are valuable, should be based on knowledge's ability to help us to intervene in context and to generate common goods. Okay, so Santos argues that knowledge as intervention in reality is the measure of realism rather than knowledge as representation of reality. So the credibility of a knowledge contribution is measured in the type of intervention that it affords or prevents. Right? It's quite a different way of considering the value of knowledge. It really boils down to what a knowledge contribution enables us to do in context. Okay. So I'm sorry, I'm feeling quite disoriented because my presentation was quite reliant on graphical stimulation. But if we recognize ourselves as knowledge workers, as scholars, if we recognize that scholarship is really about providing or storying reality, it's about providing accounts for what reality is and what it isn't. If we recognize that we are storytellers and we recognize that particular stories offer particular representations and inscriptions of reality. So Bruno Latour talks about representation and inscription, and in Pandora's Hope, his book Pandora's Hope, he describes the process of mapping biology and how a scientist goes out into the field, does field work, extracts representations of a particular ecological system, so draws on samples of grass, of animals, etc., brings them into a lab, and then creates an inscription that represents the reality of that ecological system. Right? In other words, the researcher constructs a story of reality. But Latour also argues that we have this tendency to forget that our artifacts, our knowledge artifacts, are representations and inscriptions of particular stories, particular interests, and particular ways of perceiving and knowing the world. They are momentarily stable for the purpose of coming to know something from a particular vantage point. And Ben Okri, he notes that without stories, whether they are scientific stories or other forms of stories, without stories, life would lose its moorings or lose its orientations. Even in silence, we enact and live our stories. Okay, so in the flyer that went out, you would have seen a little map of restorying written with the RE in brackets and the Y in brackets. And I write it that way because it's a constellation word. It's a word that constellates multiple things and holds them together as being interrelated and interdependent. So I just want to unpack that for a moment. Just a second. I've just realized that I might be able to share the proposal in, the thing in the chat window. Let me see if I can just drop it in. No, it doesn't allow me to do that. Okay, I thought that might work. Okay, so if we look at this constellation of words that is packed into the idea of restorying, it contains multiple words. The first is story. And from this post-abyssal perspective that I'm arguing for, there's this recognition that we create stories, and in science and in scientific knowledge work, those stories become quite naturalized, and they affirm and entrench quite a problematic colonial hegemony, which requires reconsideration and reconstitution. And so there's this invitation to restory, which is about systematically restoring the ways in which we come to know the world from a post-abyssal vantage point, one which recognizes a pluriversality of knowledges and knowers, engaging regenerative research approaches which foreground different forms of justice. Okay. And then the other two concepts are to store and to restore, which is about finding forms and modes of representation that are able to more coherently and legitimately represent knowledge work that falls outside of scientific knowledge production, or that is implicated in, but that falls from view when we are producing scientific knowledge. And then finally, there's the restoring, the bringing back into a legitimate position of different forms of knowledges and different forms of knowers, and addressing the epistemicides, or the killing off of different forms of knowledge that is a dominant colonial act. Okay, so Donna Haraway, she says it matters which ideas we use to think other ideas. And she draws on Stratham's work, Barbara Stratham. And Stratham says that it matters what thoughts think thoughts. It matters what knowledges know knowledges. It matters what relations relate relations. It matters what worlds world worlds. And it matters what stories tell stories. And this is because the stories we tell inform the ways that we live in the world and the types of interventions and mechanisms for world building that we allow ourselves. Okay, so playing with perspective. I see that there are some people who've been able to download the slides. Yay, wonderful. I'm on slide 8. And if somebody is able to share them, I would be so grateful because, as I said, I'm working a lot with visuals. Okay, so I'll need to skip those. Okay, so I'm going to start to just orienting to the idea of the abyssal line. Boaventura de Sousa Santos is I suppose you could describe him as a decolonial scholar, although I'm not sure that's completely accurate. He is a collaborator in the World Social Forum, which is a forum geared towards greater epistemic and social justice for the global south. Oh, yay! Some wonderful person has shared the slides. Thank you. Okay. Could we go to slide 9?
Priya, are you seeing the slides?
Yes, I am.
Okay, I can't see them, but it looks like it's trying to upload them.
Okay.
Can anybody else see the slides?
Yes, I can. I'm trying to move them to where Priya is.
Okay.
Oh, I'm so sorry about this, everybody. I'm attached to the slides, like I said, because I built the argument based on a visual journey, especially for this next part. So while it's loading and trying to figure itself out in the background, let me just summarize de Sousa Santos's arguments. He argues that scientific knowledge actively produces other forms of knowing the world as non-existent. And, okay, wonderful. Okay, here we go. Yay. Okay, before we talk about the abyssal line, let's just play a little bit. So you see this graphic about the world map. It's one that we are all used to seeing. It's a geographic and political map that is the most standard type of map to represent our globe. If you could change the slide, please. However, that first map is in fact inaccurate in terms of perspective and scale. So when you shift the form of inscription, when you flatten the map out in a different way, what changes is the size and the positioning of some of the continents. And in this particular instance, Africa pops up much more largely. There's a much more accurate representation or inscription of the size of Africa in comparison to the rest of the globe. Next slide, please. And this is just a different kind of map. It's taken all of the continents and positioned them into the continent of Africa. Once again, when you inscribe it in this different way, you imply or you allude to a number of knowledge claims, a number of different knowledge claims about the orientation of the planet and the political positioning of Africa in relation to the rest of the planet, the rest of the political system on the planet. Next slide, please. Okay, so here is a geographic map. If you could just click. Yeah, and this reorientation, flipping the map around, is as accurate as the previous version with Africa at the bottom and Europe at the top. So astronomically, geographically, it is as accurate a representation, but re-inscribing it in this way says something different. It challenges ideas of up and down. It challenges notions of north, south. It reconstitutes our orientation to what is naturalized, what is normative. Next slide. And then once again, another representation of the global map. This particular map is a decolonial map. It reorients and it also inscribes in ways that challenge the hegemony of English, that challenge the hegemony of particular nationalist ways of delineating space and place on the globe. And once again, it challenges us to reorient what we naturalize in terms of our planet, in terms of what a global map is and what a global map represents or fails to represent. Next slide, please. Okay, so there are many scholars who point out that the way we inscribe informs how we see the world, it informs what we can do in the world, it informs who has power and who is denigrated in the system of representation, in the system of world building, and in terms of the right to represent and inscribe what the world is. Next slide, please. Okay, so just one more quick little play around. I'm from the field of environmental education, and my colleagues love this one more than anything. So here we have a simple picture of a deer crossing the road. Next slide, please. And here we challenge that. We attempt to reconstruct that notion of the deer crossing the road by noting that, in fact, this is an image of a road crossing the forest. And what that does is it rearranges the social-ecological implications of what interventions should be engaged and why they should be engaged. It also evokes a different kind of ethico-political sensitivity around what it means to find solutions to the challenges that arise from roads crossing forests and deers crossing roads. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so Parma is just echoing what I've said previously, that the way we know has implications for the way we live, and also implications for the ethics that we mobilize in our choices for governing the way we live together. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Abyssal Line, As I said, this is the work of Boaventura de Sousa Santos. And de Sousa Santos is a sociologist and a law professor. So he works in two overlapping fields around legal systems and around epistemic activity, how we make knowledge and build knowledge. And he argues that there is an operationalization of an abyssal line that informs all scientific knowledge production. In other words, we cannot produce scientific knowledge without implementing what he describes of as an abyssal line. An abyssal line is a line or a chasm that is almost impossible to cross. So it divides two categories in quite definitive and firm ways. If you could click, please. Okay, and he says that the challenge with scientific rationality is that it claims to be, or it is afforded the position of being the arbiter of truth. It is afforded the position of being the most accurate, the most rational arbiter of what is true and what is untrue. But he says that there's a problem with that argument because, in fact, in scientific knowledge systems, what does not exist is actively produced as non-existent. It's not because science is the strongest system of knowledge production for determining truth, but rather because the way in which we construct scientific knowledge actively works to produce as non-existent other forms of knowledge. And there is, of course, a detailed and systematic argument around this, which I won't go into here because it's very long. Next slide, please. Okay, so he also points out that there is the system of agreement and coherence between the way we produce scientific knowledge, the way that knowledge is translated into our governance and economic systems, and the way the legal system takes that up and imposes control and order on the social system. So the system is aligned to the rationality of scientific knowledge. And so when you come into the space with other forms of knowledge, the systems of governance, of knowledge production, of law, simply don't recognize other forms of knowledge except as inferior to science. Okay, so they are discredited as not being as rational and as good at determining truth as science is. Next slide, please. Okay, so that's just a little image of the types of distinctions between knowledges. So on the one side, you have the knowledges that are visible, the ways of knowing the world that are visible and are credited as legitimate. And primarily amongst them, you have scientific knowledge or knowledges. And then you have a smaller line between scientific knowledges and philosophical knowledge or theological knowledge, primarily Abrahamic theological knowledge. And those three together are recognized as ways of knowing the world. They don't always agree, they're not always coherent with each other, but they are afforded visibility and space. They are managed within the knowledge system. On the other side of the line are all the forms of knowledges that are invisible. And what I've noted there are just examples. They're a selection rather than an exhaustive list. So on the other side, you have things like peasant knowledges, lay knowledges, embodied, situated, relational knowledges, the various other forms of spiritual knowledges that fall outside of the Abrahamic theology, indigenous knowledges, plebeian knowledges, etc., etc. And they are actively delegitimated in our hegemonic knowledge systems, in our colonial knowledge systems. They are designated as beliefs, opinions, intuitive or subjective understandings, superstition, magic, etc., etc. Next slide, please. Okay, so Jones, he is a moral philosopher from Canada, and he says that it's very problematic, this orientation between scientific knowledge and other ways of knowing, and between objective science and subjective experience. He says it doesn't actually matter which knowledge system you are using to make your truth claims. All knowledge systems, objective science included, are premised upon particular stories, particular accounts, inscriptions, or ways of making meaning of the world. And so they are implicated in particular moral and ethical choices. And the heart of his argument is that we cannot, in fact, build knowledge which is factual, which is outside of the subjective experience of self, because all knowledge is implicated in axiology, epistemology, and ontology. We can't make knowledge outside of that relationship, whether it be Western science or any other form of knowledge. There are always moral or ethical implications to the way that we make knowledge, to what we choose to include in our stories and what we choose to exclude. Next slide, please. Okay, and in the global north, the First Nations there talk about one-eyed seeing and two-eyed seeing. And they say that when we rely only on science, then we engage in one-eyed seeing. So I'd like to invite you just to put one of your hands up over one of your eyes and simply notice how your perception changes, how your depth perception changes, how your blind spots increase in magnitude, increase in scope, how there is a particular kind of lopsidedness when you do that. It's a very simple embodied experience, but we can use it as a metaphor for knowledge work. So when we build knowledge in a way that denies some forms of knowing and foregrounds or elevates other forms of knowing, then what we do, De Souza Santos argues, is we reduce our depth perception and we increase our blind spots. We start to take as naturalized that which can be seen from that particular eye, from that particular gaze, and we produce as invisible everything else, because everything else then challenges that way of seeing and becomes incongruent. And what he argues is that we can, in fact, work with ecologies of knowledges, multiple ways of perceiving the world, and we can do it coherently, working with different knowledges simultaneously. I see a hand over there. Oh, okay. Next slide, please. I've said that already, so next slide, please. Okay. So this practice of making invisible some forms of knowledge, translating or converting them into data, into opinion, belief, experience, while foregrounding scientific rationality as the arbiter of truth, that's what he describes as the Abyssal Line, the operationalization of the Abyssal Line. And he says that when that Abyssal Line is activated, then we perpetuate epistemic injustice. We commit epistemicides. We kill off other ways of knowing the world. And he says that this is a waste of social experience, because if we're able to leverage those ways of knowing together with scientific rationality, then we increase the potential and the possibilities for intervention in the world, for creating a common good world, for engaging BMVV, a common good life, a good life for all. Next slide, please. Okay, so he offers a system of knowledge work, which is post-abyssal in nature. In other words, it actively seeks to erode and challenge the construction and implementation of abyssal lines. Next slide. And he argues that different forms of knowledge offer or bring into view different things, and each knowledge system has its own blind spots. So if we can convene different forms of knowledges coherently, then we reduce the blind spots and we increase the potential for resolving risk and intervening in the world in ways that might generate a good life for all. Next slide. Okay, and he talks about sociologies of absences and emergences, and these are two processes, and I'll illustrate them in a moment. So sociologies of absences, that is a methodology for reading against a text. So you take a piece of knowledge, in primarily scientific knowledge, and you read for what it foregrounds and elevates and what it drops out of view, what it makes invisible or renders incommensurate with the scientific knowledge. And the sociology of emergences is a way of convening ecologies, and he identifies 5 types, including knowledges, economies, scales, temporalities, and I can't remember the last one. And so the sociology of emergences it brings different ways of knowing together to look at possibility, to look at what becomes possible when we expand beyond scientific knowledge. So what's really important here is to recognize that it's not an attempt to denigrate scientific knowledge. It's a recognition that Western science is particularly good at one mode of producing knowledge. But other modes of producing knowledge have other strengths. They bring other things into visibility. And so if you can bring them together coherently, you then increase the potential for creating a common good world. Next slide, please. Okay, so ecologies of knowledges, that's what I'm going to focus on. Ecologies of knowledges are, they're an epistemic ecology that brings together a complexity and diversity of ways of knowing the same thing, right? So let's take, for example, we've got a dirty river, or the AIDS pandemic, or tuberculosis, something like that. You convene an ecology of knowledge. You bring different forms of knowledge together in relation to that shared research object, that shared interest. How do we create a healthier river system? How do we create or generate a social safety net for people managing AIDS, or people, how do we reduce the impact of tuberculosis, right? So you bring it together because there's a shared interest, But what you do is you allow different forms of knowledges. So that might include scientific knowledges and different types of scientific knowledges. It might include spiritual knowledges, situated or contextual knowledges, etc., etc., economic knowledges or governance knowledges. You bring them together to work to resolve that shared risk. Next slide, please. Okay, and each knowledge in this ecology contributes in that it mobilizes particular knowledge practices, it provides particular vantage points, and it draws on particular epistemic resources and leverages them in service to that shared good, that shared common good. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's get practical. Let's look at the example of the citizen sciences. For those who don't know what citizen sciences are, it's when members of the public become involved in scientific research, and that little constellation up on the screen are all the different types of citizen science, types of approaches to citizen science that are out there. Next slide, please. Okay, and so I'm going to be sharing findings from an analysis of my data. So the data that I worked with, I did an epistemic mapping of 50 citizen science projects in South Africa. To my knowledge, it's one of the biggest mappings done. It's certainly the biggest one done in South Africa. I did 3 in-depth case studies with a lot more careful analysis of data, including what we commonly refer to as grey literature or grey accounts of knowledge work. And then I, because I was seeing some inconsistencies in the data, I went back to the scientific publications which were reporting on citizen science projects. I did an in-depth analysis of 67 scientific articles, but it was from a much larger pool of 263 articles. It was just too much to write up, so I focused on the 67. Okay, so the abyssal analysis, next slide. Okay, you can just keep going until the slide is full. Yes, great, thanks. So I'm calling it an abyssal analysis, and what I really mean by this is that I started off by analyzing the data from a purely scientific standpoint. I looked at different, I did analytics and a survey and things like that. And from this perspective, I found that the field of citizen science is in fact a field of citizen sciences. There's a diversity of types of practices, types of epistemic activity. And there were 2 main categories. The one category focused on generating clean data, or what Latour calls generating matters of fact. And these kinds of projects, they were not very good at enabling epistemic access to the knowledge for the volunteers. Okay, so the scientists maintained a role of a knower, of expert, and they mediated all of the knowledge interactions. And they did it through the formal system of the science policy public interface. Next slide, please. Again, you can just pop them all up. Yes, great. So the other type of project was a project that involved citizen scientists in data analysis and meaning making. And what I found was that they were more generative, that the knowledge became more usable immediately. They were much better at responding to challenges and intervening into context. And there was a greater extent of shared power in the system, right? So the volunteers who were not professional scientists took up knowledge roles much more coherently. Next slide, please. And from this level of analysis, all of the justice and knowledge arguments that emerged were related to the production of different forms of scientific knowledge, and they were underpinned by scientific rationality and a colonial understanding of the organization of the world and the governance of the world. Next. Okay, and then at the same time, there was the fees must fall movement, and we did some reading together in my community of practice, and I realized that there was a gap in my analysis. And so I followed up the abyssal work by doing a post-abyssal analysis of the same data. So I worked with the same data and I just revisited it, but this time looking for the things that D'Souza Santos argues for. Next slide, please. Okay, and this is kind of what came out of that. When I started to track how people were building knowledge, how they were establishing scientific knowledge, how they were informing themselves about what was going wrong and what to do about it. When I went back and I looked at it from a sociology of emergencies perspective, I found that every single one of the projects, in fact, mobilized an ecology of knowledges. Scientific knowledges were what popped out at the end because the scientists who were the knowledge experts were representing the knowledge in scientific terms. But the data showed that multiple forms of knowledges were being used in the construction of scientific knowledge. And this is just an example out of one of the projects. Next slide, please. Continue. Yes. Okay, so what I found in this analysis was that all of the projects mobilized scientific knowledge, but they mobilized science in different ways, in different roles. And they were not always trying to build science. Sometimes they were trying to destabilize or decenter or challenge the interventions that were foregrounded and based on scientific rationality. Okay, so they all worked with science, but sometimes for, sometimes against science, or in different kinds of ways and roles. The different knowledges were convened in diverse sequences, and the sequences mattered. The sequence in which knowledges were leveraged impacted how that knowledge could be and was used, right? And science wasn't always the most important knowledge. It was significant in all of the projects, but it wasn't necessarily the form of knowledge that enabled the greatest degree of intervention. Okay, and for me, the most startling finding was that the development, the establishing of scientific knowledge depended on and was strengthened by the mobilization of an ecology of knowledges. In other words, the science was better when there was a strong ecology of knowledges. It created more coherent scientific knowledge. Okay, and then where that ecology was active, the volunteers, the citizen scientists, members of the public were able to mobilize that co-produced shared knowledge far more rapidly than the scientists were able to do through the formal knowledge structures. Okay, they were able to intervene sometimes almost immediately in their context using that knowledge that was produced, whereas the scientists were reliant on moving that knowledge through the knowledge system and then translating it into the governance system thereafter. Next slide, please. Okay, so I was very confused about these findings, and so I went back to the literature and I'd read, hundreds of papers. And what I found when I did a sociology of absences of these papers was that what was present were descriptions of scientific rigor and issues related to data collection, protocols, etc., discussions of data findings, sometimes small descriptions of data contributors, mainly in terms of the problematic of having non-scientists collecting scientific data. And the scientists were firmly in the role of authors, knowledge producers, and experts. And the citizen scientists or volunteers, members of the public, were designated as data collectors. Okay, so that's what's present in our scientific literature. What was absent in the literature are descriptions of other than scientific forms of knowledges and their knowers, descriptions of the actualized benefits of knowledge production in local contexts, and descriptions of the types and forms of interventions that citizen scientists, amateurs, members of the public were able to engage in based on the knowledge that was produced. So here you can see how the inscription of scientific knowledge in peer-reviewed journal articles activates and enacts an abyssal line, because science is brought into visibility and all the other forms of knowledge is dropped from view. Okay, next slide. I'm getting towards the end here, so there isn't a lot more. Other way? No, other way? And one more, great. So what popped up to me, what became very visible were three particular forms of injustice in the knowledge work we are doing as scientists in the field of citizen science. That's where I was focused. And that was epistemic justice or epistemic injustice, where science was elevated and other forms of knowledge were denigrated. Contributory justice, which is about recognizing the contributors to knowledge being produced and recognizing them as epistemic contributors rather than volunteers or data collectors, etc. And then distributory or distributive justice, which is the justice of who benefits and how they benefit from knowledge being produced. And this really became evident in the post-abyssal analysis. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so Santos argues that as long as abyssal lines continue to be drawn, the struggle for cognitive or epistemic justice will not be successful if it is based solely on the idea of a more equitable distribution of scientific knowledge. Scientific knowledge has intrinsic limits in relation to the type of real-world intervention it makes possible. And what my research showed was that the science is much better, the interventions are much stronger, more coherent, more malleable and responsive when we are working with ecologies of knowledges rather than trying to generate pristine, objective scientific knowledge. Next slide, please. Okay, I think we can skip this one. Okay, so I just want to end with an invitation to consider your own context of praxis. And law suggests it's about how to make good differences in circumstances where reality is both unknowable and generative, and where risk is constantly evolving. Next slide. And this is the challenge that Alcoff gives us. She says that as scientists, we take up the role of speaking for and representing others. We represent their knowledges, we represent who they are, what they are capable of, how they interact, and what they know. And she challenges our authority as legitimate representatives, especially if we are focusing on scientific knowledge solely. You know, if that's the basis of our power of representation, and if the structures of scientific knowledge production entrench colonial activity, then are we in fact legitimate authorities of truth in our world? Next slide. So this is my last slide, and I just want to invite you to take a moment for yourselves to think about your own praxis spaces, your own disciplinary spaces, and how other knowledges are made present or absent, how knowers from different epistemic orientations are positioned, and what the forms of co-engagement are in that space. Okay, I think that's my last slide. I think there's just a context slide at the end. So, Mikateko, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Priya. So now the floor is open for questions. We've got about 27 minutes left until 2 o'clock. So if people would like to share any questions, comments, reflections on Priya's talk, you're welcome to do so. You can either do so in the chat, or you can simply raise your hand, and at which point I'll ask you to unmute yourself so you can ask your questions directly. Maybe people are still processing. Towards the end of the presentation, I found myself thinking about whether or not, doing participatory research actually allows us, as you said, to kind of stand as authority figures in a genuine and legitimate way, because very often what we end up doing, despite the fact that the research process is participatory and we're working with students and, doing digital stories or using photo voice and all of these more participatory methods, that in the end, we kind of do tend to distill or synthesize the information into a research article. And in that way, we're kind of sharing that knowledge and the information and our findings in a very sort of traditional scientific way. And we use particular discourses and certain platforms that value or kind of prioritize more traditional ways of distributing that knowledge and information. Well, that's just a comment. You can respond to it as we take questions from people. The first hand that I saw up was from Fenella. Fenella, would you like to ask your question?
Hi, Priya, thanks for your presentation. I must say your slides are absolutely beautiful, and I'm not surprised that they took a long time to be transferred. Just maybe a simple question. There's a lot of dense concepts in your presentation, and I was wondering whether you were able, you've presented kind of your findings, and I wondered if there was a way you could give us maybe some simple examples from your data I was particularly interested in the sequencing, and maybe, I don't even know if this is possible, but something from your data that showed how the ecology of knowledges and that sequencing that you had in that one slide with the diagram, how that played out, what it looked like in your data. Does that make sense?
Yes, sure. Mikateko, should we take a few questions together, or do you want me to do them one by one?
As you wish. What do you prefer?
Let's take one or two, because I might be able to synthesize across.
Okay, the next hand that I see up on my screen is from Kama. Would you like to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, Mika. Thank you so much, and thank you to Priya for such a wonderful presentation. Of course, coming from the history point of view, this is very interesting because it allows the kind of horror history, the kind of putting the actors at the center of the discussion when you talk about the issue of the objects themselves, the people in the communities having knowledge even as we go to discuss with them. And so I was wondering whether there's a best way in which we can avoid the risk of the theft of indigenous knowledge and representation of such forms of knowledge as we try to mobilize an ecology of knowledge in order to ensure that the subaltern are allowed to give their voice. And this speaks to the comment that Mikateko made earlier. So how best can we avoid the risk of theft of indigenous knowledge and misrepresentation of such forms of knowledge as we try to do this? Thank you.
Thank you, Kama. Is there another question, or shall I respond?
I think you can go ahead and respond to these two while the others come in.
Okay, so Vanilla, I love talking about my data because it was so amazing what surfaced. Let me give you two very different examples. The one is a community activist project where they were challenging the Makana municipality. The project's name is Kulumani Water for Dignity. It was started by community activists. I don't know if you know the context of Grahamstown or Makanda, but it's such a perfect microcosm for the social and ecological justice issues that perpetuate in colonial or pre-colonial states, you know, in systems that have been through colonization. So the one part of town has a relatively good supply, and the other part, the township area, has intermittent supply, very poor supply, dirty water, etc., etc., etc. So these groups of community activists started to mobilize to try and resolve this issue. And they started by trying to understand their community experiences. So they started by building situated knowledge and understanding the embodied experiences of community members, how the bodies in the communities were being affected by the poor water quality. From there, and that did include some work on some forms of indigenous knowledges, but not mainly, not at that point. They then approached Rhodes University for collaboration, or Rhodes heard of them, and nobody's quite sure how the partnership emerged, but they realized they needed to gather scientific knowledge to substantiate what they were finding and to make it recognizable, to bring that knowledge into a form that the municipality and the systems of governance in the municipality could understand, right? So they worked with Rhodes University, they collected scientific data, they learned how to analyze it, etc., and then they approached the municipality. That failed completely. The attempt to engage the municipality was completely abyssal. They then had to educate themselves about the governance system to firstly understand what their rights were, and then to understand how to lobby for those rights, how to challenge the municipal system for undermining their constitutional rights. They then went back to scientific knowledge because they had to gather other information, and they brought it all together in the context of an ecology. So the argument was made more powerful because it co-represented the scientific findings of their work, as well as the embodied experiences and the contextual and situated relationships that they were engaged in Makana municipality. I hope that's enough on that example. The other example is an example of the Custodians of Rare and Endangered Wildflowers. It's a government project. It's based in Sanby. Their job is to build knowledge about our botany in the country and the risks to that botany. And they started with an understanding of governance knowledge. So they focus on building scientific knowledge, but the way they build it is so that it is immediately understandable and translatable into the governance system, right? So they start with an understanding of governance, a governance knowledge. They then introduced and included scientific knowledge. And then from there, they worked out into their volunteers, into a volunteer network. And the data showed that what dominated their ecology was situated and contextual knowledge. So they also included indigenous knowledges, etc. But the situated and contextual knowledge and the relational knowledge, the knowledge of how relationships were constructed, how people and systems connected with each other in particular contexts, dominated their ecology of knowledge and helped to build governance knowledge that was far more coherent and usable at a contextual level in particular situated risks. Is that sufficient, Fenella?
Yeah, that was very interesting. Thanks very much. It makes a lot of sense, and it's nice to have the practical, to see, you know, how, which is also good for thinking about. I mean, I realize that sort of sustainability issues and environmental issues are perfect context for developing these, you know, for realizing ecologies of knowledge. So yeah, thanks, Priya.
Great. Amma, your question around the theft of indigenous knowledges and potential misrepresentation of these knowledges. So I want to just first challenge this idea of theft. You know, the ownership of knowledge is it's a characteristic of modernity and a characteristic of dualistic rationality or dualistic ontology, right? This idea that the subjective and the objective world are somehow coexist but aren't the same thing, and you know, that kind of thing. Within indigenous knowledge systems, at least those that I have some familiarity with, and it's not exhaustive, but you know, I've spent some time with different knowledge systems. Within these systems, knowledge is relational. The ontology of reality is relational. Everything is implicated in everything else, and everything is co-constructed. And so the idea that one can own knowledge, that one can sell knowledge, that one can steal knowledge, is something that comes from a very different understanding of reality. Now, these two realities coexist, these two ways of understanding reality, dualistic and relational ontologies, coexist. And of course, the relationship between them is very problematic, especially because dualistic rationality dominates our world and because it is implicated in so much injustice in the world, right? So we're left with this problem of how to try and protect indigenous knowledge systems or relational knowledge systems. In fact, the problem is not protecting indigenous knowledge systems, but rather challenging the laws that make it possible to sell and leverage knowledge, that make it possible to enclose knowledge, to own knowledge, right? Because that idea is incoherent with a relational knowledge system, because that knowledge system is premised on an understanding of a co-constituting and shared reality. And I don't know what we do about that. D'Souza Santos, like I said, he does a lot of work in the legal system. He's a professor of law as well, and he's done some work in that area. It's not my area of expertise, but there's a problematic there. You know, if we try and cash in on the knowledge economy when we're working with relational knowledge systems, part of what we're doing is undermining the coherence of that ontology, of that view of reality. And so I think it's not so much about stopping people from stealing knowledge as much as it is about challenging the idea that knowledge can be owned, can be enclosed, can be belong to some people and not belong to others. Certainly in my research, I know that I have some thoughts I've contributed, but really it was a shared conversation and a shared way of coming to understand the thing that I was interested in. Yeah.
Thanks, Priya. We've got a question from Dimi, who's bringing our attention to the higher education space because that's where many of us work or are situated. And he would like to know how can your way of thinking, or perhaps our way of thinking, and some of the concepts that you have mentioned in today's talk, how can those be applied or applicable to the pedagogical level or pedagogic practice, given the diverse nature of students we have in our universities or other higher education institutions, and also considering the ever-evolving ways of creating knowledge. So it's about how to bring these ideas into pedagogy.
So when the fees must fall challenges first started being issued by students, I went to a talk. It wasn't a talk, it was a very frustrated attempt at engagement on the part of students at Rhodes University. And one of the students, there was a challenge from an academic around the need for rigor. And it's an argument that's often leveraged when one tries to raise decolonial or queer or feminist or indigenous arguments for the problematic of scientific ways of producing knowledge. There's this call for rigor, that it has to be rigorous. And the student stood up and said, we're not asking you to reduce the rigor. In fact, we're doing the opposite. We're saying that you are not being rigorous enough. There isn't enough rigor in the way that we are producing knowledge in our scientific institutions. And it's an argument that really stayed with me. And I think that is the response, Ntimi, to what you're asking. It's about increasing the forms of rigor and re-establishing political, epistemic, scientific, analytical rigor in ways that challenge how science is positioned as the arbiter of truth, and rather looks at science as one way of knowing and works to establish internal systems of rigor for other forms of knowledge, right? So it's very easy with science. Science has a long history of rigor. It hasn't got the oldest history. There are other forms of knowledge that have an even longer history of rigor. But because of the colonial sort of way of perpetuating culture, what's happened is that the focus on rigor, the focus on producing knowledge, has been primarily related to scientific knowledge. And so it seems like Western science is more rigorous than other forms of knowledge. But in fact, other forms of knowledge have a lot of rigor, some of them less, some of them more. It's just that that rigor hasn't been articulated. That coherence isn't visible because those knowledge forms were denigrated. So how do we work pedagogically with this? I would say we start by exposing the blind spots of science. So we're really good at recognizing the strengths of Western science, Western scientific ways of producing knowledge, but we are really bad at acknowledging the blind spots and the weaknesses of that way of building knowledge. And so if we're able to foreground that and recognize that the claims to Western science being the only arbiter of truth or the best arbiter of truth are problematic, if we open up the space and say, how can we be more rigorous politically, epistemologically, ontologically, and we bring uncertain ways of building knowledge, uncertainty into our pedagogic practice, then we have a much more realistic space that has more potential. There are some tools. So I've part of what's come out of my my PhD work is I identified 5 forms of rigor that work to support post-abyssal kinds of research. And I'm super happy to share that, although it's still in draft form. But there are many people who have offered that kind of work, and it's really integrating and starting to mainstream those offerings. I don't know if that was, Ntimi, a very focused response, but yeah, it's what I grapple with as well.
Thank you, Priya. Thank you, Ntimi, for your question and the questions that have come in so far. So we've got about 7 minutes left. I don't see any hands that are raised, but if you are more curious about some of the things that Priya has been talking about, the concepts that she's been using, or anything that's come up during her response to the questions, do raise your hand. I see that Fanella has shared a question in the chat, and she asks in relation to bringing these ideas into pedagogy and how they translate into teaching and learning within the university space, is would it not also require greater recognition of the diversity in the classroom and a move away from the lecturer as the person who knows everything, as the expert, and the students who need to be taught the curriculum, so the students being the recipients of knowledge and so on. So would it not require greater recognition of students rather than positioning the lecturer as the expert?
Mm. So I think there are a few layers to this. The first is to recognize that our education system is aligned to our governance and our knowledge production system, and it's dominated by scientific rationality, scientific ways of knowing the world, Western scientific ways of knowing the world, because there are other scientific approaches as well. So the first thing is to recognize that the system is constructed to make some ways of knowing visible and to elevate some ways of knowing and to denigrate others, and that there is a politics at play. It's a politics of colonization. It's a politics of perpetuating a particular world view and spreading that out from the center to the periphery. And it comes, it is designed to accrue economic benefit, political power, geographic power, domination of resources, etc., etc. We've already got the research, mountains of research that show this, that demonstrate this, using scientific analysis. They help us to see that these are in fact the ways the system operates. It doesn't mean the entire system is bad. It simply means that systems arise through ongoing practiced social interactions. The systems become established because we interact with each other in particular ways. So one part of it is to challenge that system and to work for greater coherence or towards greater coherence, right? And part of that is curriculum reform. Part of that is working with teachers to think in more complex ecologies of knowledges, etc., etc. The other is to recognize that there is a distinction between knowledge and opinion. So even when we work with ecologies of knowledges, we're not talking about a relativism that anything anybody feels, knows, thinks, has an idea about is true. That's not what we're working with. We're talking about an increased rigor and a way of working which strives for greater coherence and greater visibility of the assumptions of particular approaches to knowledge work, right? So in our universities, we're dealing with older students, not young students, and they have certainly situated and contextual knowledges. Many of them have embodied knowledges. They might have indigenous or more traditional or cultural knowledges, but that doesn't necessarily position them as experts, right? They they have knowledge that they can leverage, but that knowledge is not necessarily equal just because it is present. Okay, what makes that knowledge legitimate in any space is whether it helps to resolve the thing that you are focusing on together. Yeah, so that's just the one thing I wanted to raise. It's not an argument for relativism that anything goes, but rather for systematic coherence and systematic rigor across different forms of knowledges. And what that means is that in a classroom setup, there might well still be a knowledge expert, but that knowledge expert would foreground the type of expertise they're bringing into the space and would open up space for other forms of expertise. And all of those knowledge contributions would then, you would engage with all of them and look at all of them and work together to understand what is coherent, what is legitimate, or what isn't. You know, just because I have a spiritual belief doesn't mean it's a legitimate belief in the context of a particular problem. On the other hand, it could be definitively legitimate. It could be definitively powerful in terms of intervening in the world or reconstructing reality so that it enables a stronger common good. I don't know if that was clear, Fenella.
It was, thanks.
Great, thank you, Priya. We just have a minute left, so I'm going to wrap up today's session and start off by thanking you very much for your talk, which I hope was stimulating and inspiring and informative for everybody here today. So thank you all for joining us in the second installment of our SARChI-HEHD seminar series. Just a reminder that our next talk will be taking place on the 31st of August, and our speaker will be Leslie Powell. But do join me in thanking Priya for presenting to us today. If you'd like to take the discussion further or contact her to collaborate and connect on other ideas and learn more about her work, her email is on the screen right now. But yeah, I'm just going to applaud you, if I can do it electronically using these functions. And then if you would like to also unmute yourself and join me in giving her a round of applause, that would also be great.
Thank you so much for your time and for creating the possibility of this discussion. Yeah, I'll be around for a little bit if anybody wants to continue to